Video game music is as old as video games itself. While they originally started out as blips and chiptunes into the arcade, to musician bands on consoles, to being performed by full-fledged orchestras all across the world. And if that's not enough, there are websites devoted to remixes by fans which official companies have used for their soundtracks in games. MagFest is one of the biggest video game conventions all around, celebrating video game culture, including video game music. Musicians themselves have been influenced to make tribute bands named after various consoles, characters, peripherals, and that's not including the many songs that have been released as official singles based on video games. Oh, you thought I was joking there. Those are all legitimate songs. Bottom line, I love music. I love video games. It's a match made in heaven. And when it comes to video games, sometimes when games get re-released, remade, retooled, or refurbished for distribution, everything usually gets an uplift and changed, including the music. Sometimes they get changed for one reason, and they've not always been for the better. Most of the time. So today we look at these altered tracks, these different beats, and these modified tones that even Peter Molyneux would blush at. But, hello you, I am Zion Kraze, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 7 times video game soundtracks were completely changed. We start off this video with one of the well-known soundtrack changes, and possibly the first one to this to happen to. Sonic the Hedgehog CD, or Sonic CD for short, for the Sega Mega CD is one of the most beloved games that was released on a console add-on that no one I knew had growing up, but it is considered one of the best Sonic games that was ever released. Introducing both Amy Rose and Metal Sonic, or as I've always known him from Sonic the Comic, Metallix the Terminator. The game itself involves time traveling, with the music actually taking different paths in the game, with good and evil versions of the songs. As you've heard here, the soundtrack is vastly different for both games, and it's a clash of musical styles for both the West and the East, and the middle if you want to get technical about it. For the original Japanese and European one, we got a house/techno feel that was created by Natafumi Hayata and Natsufumi Ogata, and for America, Spencer Nielsen and David J. Young were brought on to create a more atmospheric and rock-oriented feel for the soundtrack. Both of them clearly have their own unique style and feel towards them, and they both work in their own right. But sadly, it's been a long debate between fans which is better, the original Japanese one or the American one. Even Spencer Nielsen himself was interviewed by this, and he had this to say.
I think the controversies surrounding the two versions of the game soundtrack were really blown out of proportion. Honestly, I've had hundreds of people tell me that they love the score I wrote for that game, and I'm sure the Japanese version had tons of fans as well, so everybody wins in the end. As it should be. After all, it's only a game.
Eventually, Sega had released both of the soundtracks on the 2011 game release, minus a couple of Japanese tracks however, and since they've been both been released, hopefully this will put an end to this debate. Oh, who am I kidding? That's never gonna happen. Terminator 1 and 2 are considered some of the best movies to have ever been made. The first one kickstarted the careers of James Cameron, Linda Hamilton, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the sequel is regarded as one of the best sequels, nay, the best movie to have been made. The games based on them, however, have the opposite effect and are considered some of the worst of all time. The next one, made by Radical Entertainment, yes, that one, and released by Mindscape and sub-licensed by everyone's favourite punching bag Bethesda, is particularly infamous for being a terrible game with difficult gameplay and ugly graphics. But we're not here to talk about that, we're here to talk about Paul Wilkinson's soundtrack, who was uncredited by the way. As for the music, I have to admit, there are some decent tracks that have been produced here. There's also plenty of terrible ones. And there's one here that you're going to hear 75% of the time because you can't get past the damn sewer section. Ugh, that is just terrible to listen to. And the poor sods must have been tortured listening to this over and over again. Of course, this being compared to the Super Nintendo, who was also done by Mindscape and another group, Grey Matter, you would think this would have been an improvement over the previous one. And you would be right! Peter Stone's soundtrack is not only an improvement over the NES version, it is very underappreciated. Not only does the music sound atmospheric, but it just gives you chills just listening to it. But sadly, when playing the game, however, you'll never be able to hear it properly because some bright spark thought it would be a brilliant idea to have the terrible sound effects overlap the music to make it near impossible to hear it. Well, I can't say I'm totally shocked about this. Bethesda, after all. Fun fact here, the SNES version actually includes more music for the game that wasn't used, including 3 versions of the Terminator 2 Judgment Day theme. So were they going to be doing Terminator 2 originally, or was this going to be an even longer game including the second movie? We may never know. It's a shame that we never got a good licensed Terminator platformer game during the 16-bit era. Or did we? Ooh. Okay, you can say that I'm cheating here by having these 2 games here together, but both of these games have the same story behind them with the same composer. It would have been near impossible to ignore just one of these games, so it's best to talk about them together. The Binding of Isaac, the roguelike escape from the horror that is Mom game, and Super Meat Boy, the hard as nails platformer that has certain animal killing group #1 enemy just for the namesake alone, both developed by Edmund Macmillan during his Newground days until they were fully released as games later on. The composer of these games was Danny Baranowski, which, ironically enough, was my introduction to the Binding of Isaac before I even played the game. The music for Binding of Isaac is murky, dreary, and claustrophobic, which really suits the atmosphere here. And the soundtrack from Rebirth onwards does a decent enough job, but the Super Meat Boy soundtrack, however, is a different story. The original soundtrack is a catchy 90s inspired chiptune with a mixture of metal and orchestra flair to boot, while 2015 version adds banjo. Alright, that's a bit of an unfair assessment overall. Ridiculin had the unenvious task of trying to make a new soundtrack that tried to make something similar to Danny's original soundtrack that led to be generous, it's okay. the changes to the score had divided fans is an understatement. Some prefer the original soundtrack to the changed ones, well, for Super Meat Boy in particular, but the question does remain, why was there a change in the first place? Well, this one comes down to good old licenses with the original artist, Danny Baranowski himself. Edmund never really owned the rights to the soundtrack and he left them all to Danny in the first place. And when it came to licensing to the game on the PS4, that's when the soundtrack changed to the Ridiculin soundtrack, and Danny himself had explained this in an interview.
You may also know that I did not do the soundtrack for The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. I made a decision a couple years ago to end my working relationship with them for many reasons that don't really need to be listed here. I apologize for any disappointment this may have caused my fans. I own all the rights to my music, and Team Meat approached me to license the music for the PS4 and Vita versions. I didn't feel like the license fee and exposure through PSN they offered was enough to make me seriously consider accepting the deal. I decided to decline their offer. I wish them and the new artists the best of luck with the game.
And that's where the story ends for The Binding of Isaac. But funny enough, this isn't where the story ends for Super Meat Boy. The Steam version of Super Meat Boy in 2017 had got the original soundtrack, including a beta patch, the version 1.2.4, and eventually it was released a year later for the full game release. So if you don't like the Ridiculin soundtrack, you can just simply change it back to the original game. Shame it's not in any other version. Oh well, what can you do? And now from one horror game to another.
This isn't a horror game.
You wanna bet?
Echo the Dolphin is a game that I have a love-hate relationship with. I love the soundtrack that came from it, both for the Mega Drive and Sega CD version, and it looks beautiful seeing what lurks in the ocean below. However, I've never actually beaten this game because it's ridiculously hard and it was done intentionally, and I've never gotten past that octopus 8 arms when I was a kid, and people complained that Lion King was tough. Try getting past this monster without hearing this. Anyhow, both of these soundtracks are wonderful and composed by the same people instead of other individuals for once. Andreas Magdria, Brian Colburn, and Spencer Nielsen. Yep, the same composer from the Sonic CD game. The atmosphere and the surroundings work so well for both of these games, but it's hard for me to say which one of these is the better because they both work in their own right. But funny enough, the Sega Mega CD version was released as an official album with some songs from the sequel game, Tides of Time, and the PC version of Echo the Dolphin uses the CD soundtrack. The soundtrack is definitely worth checking out on its own right, and if you do want to play the game, try find Echo the Dolphin Fixed and Enhanced Edition. It is the definitive version of the game. Also, this game was released on the GBA, it only had one track on it, and it sounds like absolute shit. Avoid at all costs. And finally, to cap off this musical change-up, we have quite possibly the most controversial changes on here, and another one that was done recently in the last few years that no one really noticed. And once again, it's a double feature because it involves the same artist. But more on him later. Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition, besides being the wordiest title here, is the third version to be released of the original Biohazard on the PlayStation. I'm personally not a fan of these games, but I cannot deny the impact that it's had on gaming as a whole, for better and for worse. This has been remade and ported several times, but the third PlayStation one is being compared here with the first. The original soundtrack, composed by Motoko Tomosawa, Akira Kaeda, and Matsumi Ueda, got redone to a fully orchestral sound by a different composer, who's not being mentioned at the moment. The reason why it was changed because game producer Shinji Mikami wanted to update the soundtrack for Resident Evil when it got re-released originally for the Director's Cut edition due to delays for the Resident Evil 2 game. But that never happened with that re-release, but he managed to do so with the DualShock edition, for better and for worse, as we'll soon hear. The soundtrack was only used for this particular game, and I'm not gonna lie, the soundtrack does indeed have some good songs on here being compared to the original that do help the mood. But unfortunately there are some bad tracks as well, and they sound like they don't even belong here in the first place. I know that Resident Evil was inspired by B-movies, but they didn't need to resemble with it with the music. Oh, and of course, how could I possibly forget? Trumpet fighting basement music. Oh, come on. Did you really think I'd forget this obvious one? This one song alone is what this game will forever be associated with, and all that goodwill that was made before was just undone by one dire track. Eventually, Capcom did remake Resident Evil 1 for the GameCube and had Shusaku Uchiyama, an in-house composer, make the soundtrack for them, and it's honestly better than this dreadful shit. And yet surprisingly, the composer for the infamous Resident Evil game was brought back for the new inspired Resident Evil game, but with ninjas, Omnimusha Warlords. And once again, the soundtrack was changed from the original PlayStation 2 release. The soundtrack was changed around about this time, most likely to hide the original artist behind this, while showing their name in the credits anyway and completely ignore the composer for the remake. Nice job there, Capcom! Not giving Ray Kondo the credit he deserves is just terrible. Imagine if someone else was getting credit for someone else's work here. Who would be stupid enough to do that? And with that blatant segue, let's finally talk about the artists involved with these games that I've conveniently left out. The composer of this music was done by Mamoru Samaguchi, and he was stated as the digital age Beethoven, deafness and all. Well, I say he was deaf, but it turns out he had recovered his hearing in 2011. And this revelation had came out when he was ousted to not even writing his own music. Yep, not only did Mamoru not write his own music, it was composed by someone else entirely, Takashi Nagari. So not only was he faking his disability, he was faking his music credibility.
Wow, what a comparison!
complete bastard!
I know that Juicier Story was more behind the scenes than focusing on the game's soundtrack itself, but this was just too good not to talk about. The damage to Mamoru's career has been made and he's never recovered from this, and rightfully so. Just ignore the fact that Capcom didn't remove Mamoru's name from the credits of Onimusha Warlord's remaster and not properly credit Takashi instead. But he's not the only one whose career has been damaged due to being blacklisted from the industry due to controversy. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. Hello you! Thanks ever so much for checking out this video! A big thanks to Drift the Wolf and ZeroMaster for their voiceovers, AniiTaRuiz for the awesome cartoon avatars here, Kenisu-of-Dragons for the brilliant title card, and a big thank you for the guy that left the influence for this video and the source of this April Fool's video, Guru Larry himself. Hi Larry, I hope you enjoyed the video. By the way, subscribe to Guru Larry if you haven't. Oh, and subscribe to me as well, I guess.